Outside of a few years in the military, I spent most of my career in the private sector before I ended up in the federal government. And while I was there in the private sector, I found myself really wishing that I could instead be a federal government employee. And there were a few reasons that I felt that way. So I want to share some of those reasons with you in this video in case you're weighing your options to help you make that decision. So the first reason I left the private sector for the federal government is probably pretty obvious, and that is for the job security. So in other words, how easy it is for you to get fired when you're in the private sector. And some people might try to tell you that it's far less likely for you to get fired than you might think. But in my experience, I observed the exact opposite. I saw people getting fired left and right, and it was really only a matter of time before the same thing happened to me. And it doesn't really even have to be for a justifiable reason. Somebody could fire you because they just don't like you. Really, anything is fair game in the private sector. And it struck me as very irresponsible of me to hang up something that's very important, my livelihood basically, on something that's inherently unreliable. And in the federal government, it's the exact opposite. So I can sleep easy knowing that at the very least, it's difficult for me to get fired, and that whoever wants to do that has to have a very good reason. Now, another thing you'll hear is from employers in the private sector that your job is fairly secure. I've certainly heard that once or twice. People will tell me that it's not that easy for me to be let go from that particular organization. But at the end of the day, what somebody says is not nearly as trustworthy as what they put in writing. So the reality is your job is just not that secure in the private sector, and you could be let go in the blink of an eye. And at that point in time, you're going to be dead in the water without an income, without a livelihood, or a way to sustain your livelihood. And there's no telling how long it's going to be before you can procure employment elsewhere. Now, the second reason I left the private sector is also probably pretty obvious, and that is because I wanted the prospect of not just a comfortable retirement, but a secure one. I want, at some point in my life, to be able to sustain myself without having to worry about that means of sustenance running out. And when you're in the private sector, that's pretty much the case. You have to just save enough money and hope that by the time you leave your company that you're not going to run out of money. And it's pretty much entirely on you. Even though some organizations will do some sort of a matching program, the reality is when you leave, that ends and you're completely on your own. Whereas in the federal government, that means the sustenance never ends. You have a guaranteed income for the rest of your life once you reach a certain age. And that's not to say that you can't achieve that in the private sector. It's just that you have to be very skilled and you have to work very hard in order to increase your compensation and therefore be able to stash away a substantial amount of money. And I just never saw myself as being that skilled. I mean, I'm pretty good, but I'm not that great. Number three, I want the work that I do at my job to go towards making the world a better place, even if it's in some tiny, insignificant way. Because something is better than nothing. And when you're in the federal government, you have some semblance of that, because you're working for an organization and not an individual. But in the private sector, it's the opposite. Your work is just going towards lining the pockets of your bosses. And that hit me even harder when I realized how much I just hated working for who turned out to be very toxic people. The type of boss that you just want to punch in the face because they were just disrespectful and unappreciative. But when I also furthermore realized that I couldn't really do anything about that and I just had to keep my head down and do whatever they said, I felt like I was basically an indentured slave. And lastly, you could go either way on this one, and it is the bureaucracy. And I say you could go either way on it because it does have its downsides, such as the fact that things tend to move a little slower and it's harder to surpass people and stand out when you're more or less all treated the same. But at the same time, it does have many upsides, namely that you can guarantee at least one or two things. And guarantees are very important to me because that's how I mitigate risk. So you can guarantee things like the rate at which you get promoted or you get pay raises and how much those pay raises are going to be. And bureaucracy acts as a system of accountability. Because as they say, power corrupts. So I believe that's very necessary to have that system of accountability. Because if somebody has just supreme absolute authority, they're going to tend to enact decisions that just end up benefiting themselves, that are often to your detriment. But when there's a system there, they may still try to do that, but they're going to be much less successful in getting to the end result of enacting those decisions. And you're going to have a much better shot because some of that power is appropriated to the system. So the outcome is going to end up being a little bit more fair. Whereas in the private sector, there's no system of accountability at all. It might seem like there is on the surface, but really there isn't. The managers and executives can pretty much do whatever they want, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. Now, I'm certainly not saying that the private sector is to be avoided like the plague. I'm just saying that I prefer the government. And it is individually dependent, so you just have to decide what works best for you, and you'll certainly thrive in whatever position you find yourself in, so long as you put a little bit of thought into it beforehand. And hopefully this video helps you make that decision. So let me know if it does, or if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.